Unlearning silence is not about always saying everything to everyone. The world is far too noisy and complex for that. Unlearning silence is noticing when you're choosing silence or when silence is being chosen for you. We learn silence from the reactions of the people around us. When we spoke up, and that could be even when we were kids, and we were shushed. When we asked a question in class at school, and we were told we were being disruptive. When we tried to make a comment in the meeting at work, and they didn't actually have to say anything. That look that they shot us told us everything we needed to know. We think about our cultural expectations based on the identities we carry. We start to see that silencing our needs or even silencing our identities is what allows us to acculturate, assimilate, and often get or keep a seat at the table. We each silence each other. I hate to say it, and yet it's the most honest answer I can give. If we are human beings, we end up silencing the people around us because we each have different preferences, wiring, habits. And if we're not discussing them, if we're not interrogating them, then we perpetuate the habits that have always been there. One way we silence people is we fundamentally underestimate how difficult it is to speak up. If your voice, your presence in a room has always been welcomed, then it is likely that you assume the same about everyone else. So I have worked with many a well-intentioned leader across industry and geography that says, just speak up, as if it is that easy. But I also know from the diagnostic calls with the people who report to them, who say, I can't actually do that. Right? Either from my learned experience, my learned silence, or because of the real and perceived costs of using my voice in this context. Second way we silence people is to assume and expect that for them to communicate, they have to look and sound like us. They have to use the communication medium that we prefer. So, pick up the phone, just give me a call. That statement is so well-intentioned. But if someone actually communicates more effectively and more easily by typing, having to pick up the phone and call creates a barrier to communication. So what's the solve? To support rather than silence them, it's to figure out what communication mediums make it easiest for you to express your thoughts and feelings, and allow people to use the mediums that play to their strengths rather than create an additional barrier to entry of using your voice by having to play to your preferred medium. One of the ways that we silence ourselves is that we mitigate our speech. A pattern I noticed in working with clients across industries was we are not as clear as we think we are. In our minds, we might be thinking, stop it. But what we really say is, oh, that's interesting. And that disconnect between how clear we think we are because of what we're thinking and what we actually put into the conversation is a key way that we end up silencing ourselves. As much as we might wish it, other people cannot read our minds. And so the more clear that we can be, increasing our level of directness, the more likely people can actually understand what we're thinking. Let's also acknowledge that this goes back to cultural silencing. Many women, people of color, people who carry subordinated identities use low power language or indirect language because directness is not considered acceptable for us in our contexts. The point isn't to always be direct. The point is to notice when you might be mitigating your speech and have the range and the flexibility to leverage different levels of directness. Having to find your voice as a grown adult can be incredibly disorienting. I am a grown adult. I should know what my voice is. And yet, for those of us who have been incredibly considerate, put aside our own thoughts and feelings, if we have spent our lifetimes channeling someone else's voice, solving for someone else's needs, it makes sense why we might not be familiar with our own voice. I'd certainly put myself in that camp. But instead of asking in a meeting, what would my manager say? What does leadership want me to say? What would my mother have me say? To start asking the question, what do I think? What do I think as you're listening to a podcast, an interview, reading an article starts to remind you that you have thoughts and feelings of your own that are going to be different based on your life experience, your perspective, and where you sit. Also, start with the assumption that you do have a voice. If I had a voice, what would I do here? And you can't find your voice in isolation or just in your head. So it's going to take some experimentation. I'd encourage low-risk, time-bound experiments for the next 3 days, for the next 3 weeks. I'm going to try asking a question in a meeting. For the next 3 weeks, if someone mispronounces my name, I'm going to say, actually, my name's Elaine. Find someone to be a sounding board. Sounding boards were literally a board above a pulpit that reflected back and amplified the sound. A sounding board doesn't tell you what to do. A sounding board holds up that mirror because oftentimes what things sound like or feel like inside our head and our heart are different than when we actually articulate them. A sounding board can reflect back to you what they hear, and from that, you can analyze what's going on. The silence we learned in our own family of origin or in how we grew up does not have to be the silence that we live today or tomorrow. Unlearning silence is about being aware of the messages that we've internalized and interrogating which ones served us. Those messages might have served us well in the past, but if they don't serve who we are today and who we are becoming, unlearning silence is the opportunity to choose a different way. But it starts by being aware of what assumptions we hold, what habits we perpetuate. And in that awareness, in that conscious choice, we have the opportunity to break the cycle for the generations to come, to raise our kids in a different way, to build teams that operate differently than the ones that we've been part of. But unlearning silence is not just about making it better for the people who come after us. Unlearning silence is also about each of us getting our needs met today and living a life that is the one that we want to live.